Welcome everyone to our virtual event. Thank you for joining us. My name is Aaron Greener. I'm the Program and Office Manager at the Alberta in Jerusalem. And we're pleased to bring you a discussion in response to Kristine Garroway and John Martens' new edited book, Children and Methods, Listening to and Learning from Children in the Biblical World, published by Brill in late 2020. So we have with us today 4 panelists, including the editors, Kristine and John, who will present the book and discuss it. First of all, Kristine and John will present the book for about 30 minutes. And then the respondents, Shawn, Flynn, and Julie Faith Parker, will then have about 10 to 15 minutes to discuss aspects of the book which they have found particularly interesting. They have free latitude to comment on what they found useful or thought-provoking in the book, or what may require further research. Kristine and John will have a few minutes to respond to any of the comments, and all the panelists will then have a chance to address any questions that you, the audience, may have. You're welcome to ask questions in the Q&A section at any time during the workshop. You see you have a little icon at the bottom of your screen. And like I said, I'll field these questions at the end for the panelists to respond to. We actively encourage you to support the Albright in any way you can so that we can continue to offer you these free quality programs. And I'll provide several useful links throughout the workshop. Okay, so the co-editors of this book are Kristine Henriksen Garroway, who is a visiting assistant professor of Hebrew Bible at the Los Angeles campus at HUC, or Hebrew Union College. She researches children in the ancient world with a focus on ancient Israel. John Martens is professor of theology at the University of St. Thomas in St. Paul, Minnesota. He researches children in Greco-Roman antiquity and Second Temple Judaism, including the New Testament. I now invite the editors, beginning with Kristine, to present their book. So Kristine, the stage is yours.
Thank you everyone for joining us. All right, first let me thank the Albright for inviting us and hosting this book launch and conversation. Here we are. So children are getting their moment in the spotlight as scholars have started paying more attention to them. Before I move into the book, I want to begin by providing some background for the book and framing the questions the book seeks to answer. My own interest in children started about 20 years ago when I was thinking about a dissertation topic. At this time, not much had been done or written about children in the biblical or ancient Near Eastern world. Families and women were the topic du jour, and I was told there was not much more that could be done with children. Sorry, I think I froze here. All right. Anyways, I'll proceed. I found that interest in children was starting to gather some steam in European archaeology and also in classics. Studies had catchy titles like Greta Lillehammer's A Child is Born and Catherine Camp's Where Have All the Children Gone? And Julie Wildman's The Hide and Seek of Childhood Archaeology. The titles pushed me to ask the same questions for the Bible and the ancient Near East. 2 decades later, I am still asking the same questions. Our volume is one of a few in recent years that has come out. Some of this work has approached the topic of children and childhood as a subject area, like one might approach dress, gender, or foodways. And here I want to point out a subtle nuance. There are works that have been done that reference children simply because they happen to be a part of the document or text under investigation. For example, scholars working on adoption texts with the aim of understanding the institution of adoption might just simply discuss children in the course of their work. This is different from scholars who are now choosing to focus on, say, only the children in adoption texts, or, for example, children in war, to learn more about the social history of an adopted child or child experiencing war. Other scholars, generally biblical text scholars, have approached children as the center of a new field, childist interpretation, i.e. a field that puts children first. Julie will be saying a little more about this later. And there's also another group that has begun to look at children through the lens of theology. Sometimes these groups and focuses overlap. The Children and Methods volume stands out from these other books in two ways. First, it highlights the different ways that one can study children. The volume covers a variety of known methods of higher criticism. Each chapter begins by offering an overview of the methodology the essay employs. Like Gail Yee's book on judges, this makes our volume useful for students. Not only does it provide an accessible introduction to higher criticisms, but it then models how one uses the criticisms by applying it to a biblical passage. Second, interacting with different fields shows how children are important and can be studied from many different angles. Pausing to, quote, find children is a worthwhile enterprise when reading the Bible and studying the ancient world. John will be saying more on the first essay, Feminist Criticism in Children, so I will begin with an overview that mentions Stephen Wilson's paper on children and masculinity studies. Stephen notes the natural overlap between childhood and masculinity studies, but rues that masculinity studies has not seized the opportunity to engage much with studies on children and childhood. Instead, because of how masculinity studies originated, it is focused on how masculinity is pitted against femininity. Wilson notes that while male-female foil has been a very productive area of study, scholars of masculinity have missed opportunities to think about how manhood is contrasted to boyhood. And it is here where masculinity studies might find a natural overlap with the study of children that it has so far overlooked. Wilson's point is quite well to the point. Whereas feminist criticism calls out the androcentric nature of the text and scholarship on them, Children and Method notes the adult-centric nature of text and scholarship. Children can get easily overlooked. Stopping to pay attention to children can open up new worlds and provide new perspectives. Jason Riley's essay examines children in Assyrian iconography. He uses the Lachish reliefs as a case study. These reliefs have been analyzed since the day they were discovered. References have been made to scenes with entire families being deported, but no one has stopped to think about what that meant or how the scenes with children interact with the more gruesome scenes focusing on adults. In a very powerful section, Riley discusses the rhetoric of the relief, how peace and order contrasts with violence and chaos. Children are not harmed physically. However, one child is put in the same register as that of a man whose skin is being flayed. Riley concludes that the way the register was to be read means that the boy was being led by the torturer in order to instill in him a lesson. Innocent people who submitted, like the boy, would not be harmed, but those who rebelled against the empire would feel its full wrath. Dana Nolan Fuel's essay also takes on the issue of identity through a narratological approach, asking how the Bible's children do the work of identity construction and maintenance in ancient contexts and how they do this in contemporary cultures. Using the body of Isaac and his experience in the Akedah as a theodicy, she demonstrates how the Akedah narrativizes the end of history for Jewish people and for the Jewish community. How might future generations of priests use the example of the Akedah to demand people obey divine commands? Fuel takes the reader on a theological journey read through Isaac's life, questioning how one can understand the divine when confronted with such suffering. Since Julie and Shawn will each be discussing their own work, I will move now to discuss my piece. Like Riley's piece, I move away from the biblical text to focus on how ancient children can be found in archaeology when thinking about children creatively. It is often difficult to see children in the archaeological record because, save for inhumations, they do not seem to leave a noticeable mark. Yet they were there. They must have been, because children are needed to perpetuate society. Greta Lillehammer's aforementioned article challenged archaeologists to find children by thinking about the world of children. My essay embraces what I call a childist archaeology, one that places the child at the center of my investigation. To this end, I chose to look for children through the lens of enculturation. I investigate the area of crafting, specifically skill learned through play. My study demonstrates the presence of children in the archaeological record as witnessed through the creation of so-called buttons. I examine them as objects of craft, arguing that the skills learned to create them might be transferred to other mediums. These so-called buttons are mystifying yet ubiquitous. Perforated two-hole discs pop up in sites peppered across the southern Levant. They cross not only geographical space, but time periods as well, from MB2 to Iron Age 2. The function of the two-hole discs have stymied archaeologists and defy a single nomenclature. I follow a suggestion by Gus Van Beek, later taken up by Rona Abisar-Lewis, and identify some of these perforated items as toys. The toy would be used like this. One runs a string through both holes and ties it in a loop. You would then wind the string up, wind it up, and then pull it taut, and then the button would slide up and down. The objects in consideration are all objects in secondary use. The objects were made by chipping away at the edges to round them. Holes were made by either boring straight through or more commonly from both sides. The discs all vary in size and weight. By comparing buttons from various sites, we can see that they vary in skill production. Looking at the left slide, you can see how the buttons are more rounded, the holes are cleaner, more centered, and of equal diameters. Straighter holes appear to be made with a tubular drill going straight through, while the more angled ones are bored from either side. The buttons on the right side here have a choppier shape, and in many the holes are less precise. I would suggest that the objects on the left were made by more skilled artisans, perhaps adults, and those on the right by less skilled artisans, such as children. Seeing as how the buttons are made from pottery and secondary use, there's not a lot to lose if a child messed up. A child could easily chip away at body shards. Despite the uneven shape of the buttons on the right, they were not discarded. Rather, holes were drilled in them. In many of the examples, the holes are either unevenly spaced, too close together, or one hole is larger than the other. This again suggests an unskilled hand. Studies in lithics and ceramics discuss age-related errors. The ability to conceive and execute spatial symmetry has been shown to increase with age, which again would point to a child producing the items on the right. The variation in unskilled buttons, with some having nicer edges, cleaner holes, or more evenly spaced holes, might indicate the work of children of different ages. The skills used in the study are twofold: chipping or rubbing to form a rounded object, and boring holes. The first skill can be applied to the production of ceramic stoppers, some spindle whorls, and perhaps to an initial formation of beads. The second skill can be used in more advanced craft, such as making loom weights, bead making, spindle whorl production, or working with bone pendants. In these latter crafts, the placement and the centering of the hole is of utmost importance to the final product. More advanced crafts are generally made of harder raw materials, such as limestone, semi-precious stone, and bone. Learning the skills on toys made of materials that are easier to manipulate might allow for eye-hand coordination to develop and encourage children to practice their skills. As the final test case, look at the objects made with a single hole. The similarity in the quality of the items seen in the left column over here shows a similar skill set used in making the single hole items identified as spindle whorls, seen in the center. These were not usable whorls on the left, since the holes were not centered, big enough, or in some cases even finished. So what were these ceramic objects? Perhaps they represent a child's early attempt at learning how to shape and craft spindle whorls. Other more evenly rounded discs, such as those on the right side, with holes placed in the center, might represent another stage in a child's learning process. The more accurately shaped might be used as a child's spinning toy. I tested out my hypothesis by engaging in some experimental archaeology. I presented a class of grade school students with raw materials, pre-fired clay, and boring tools, and asked them to try and replicate the button toy. The results were interesting. We did not have a lot of time, and none of the children were able to bore through their pieces. I did find that one child found a pre-made hole and made their object into a spinning top. And that's the object you see in the picture here. I suggest that crafting skills were learned via playing. From a young age, children were taught how to make spinning toys, either buttons or tops, from ceramic body shards. Sherds were plentiful and relatively malleable compared to stone, and making them a perfect learning medium. In making toys, children gained a specific skill set, chipping and rubbing, and also multiple skills needed for drilling, spatial placement, and fine motor skills. These could be later transferred to other materials. Oops, sorry, my slides advanced. All right, so in conclusion, whether or not ancient children made these buzzes, any or all of the two-hold items in my study, the important takeaway is that my study considers the possibility that children were active participants in making material culture. The approach that I took with my essay places children at the center of the investigation. And this approach is the same thing that all the authors in our volume took, regardless of the methodology, text, or artifact under consideration. The final chapter of our book therefore discusses commonalities that appear in the different chapters, such as pointing out the adult-centric nature of the data and previous research, giving the child a voice and reassigning them agency when possible, and significantly highlighting the interplay of a child's value and vulnerability within their family and society. With this, I'm going to hand it over to John, who will discuss the aspects of the book and our field that relate to children in the New Testament, early Christianity, and Greco-Roman studies. And he'll also discuss why studying children is important. Thanks.
Thank you, Kristine. And thank you to the Albright Institute for allowing us to offer this presentation of our book. It's much appreciated. So I'm going to range a little bit more broadly before coming to the chapters that deal with the New Testament in our book, giving a bit of a sense of children in antiquity, the fact that they're there, and why we should be looking for them. One of the major works of the last 15 to 20 years is an online bibliography started by Ville Vuolanto, a Finnish scholar, in which he tracks all of the research being done on childhood studies, childist interpretation. In 2008, that entry had 1,140, or that bibliography had 1,140 entries. In January 2018, it had 2,351. Much of that growth has come from the study of children in the New Testament and early Christianity, as well as Second Temple Judaism. In fact, in 2017, over 350 articles and books focused on children and childhood in the Hebrew Bible, the New Testament, and Judaism more broadly. So in our introduction, the study of children in the Bible, New Questions or a New Method, we looked at how the field got started, the influence from classical studies, researchers such as the late, great Mark Golden at the University of Winnipeg, who's been very influential, not only on myself, but a number of the scholars who contributed to our volume. He wasn't the only classical scholar involved in this work, though. We also see the work of Brill in Roman studies, and that started then to have an impact on scholars working in biblical studies and in Judaism. And one of the things that's important is that we start to look for the children because they're there. And like Christy, I was told when I started to do this work, nothing to see here. But a starting point is to try to determine who is a child in antiquity. The cultural differences between antiquity and today are profound, but there are biological realities at play. And Christy has an article in the T&T Clark Handbook on methodology, where she describes the basic biological reality of childhood as well. And that's not a shock or a surprise. And these things transcend cultures and transcend time to some degrees. But that's why the categories outlining biological childhood are not the end of the discussion, but really the start, because you do find these stages described in Greek texts, in Jewish texts, in Roman texts. So I'm not going to go over these in any great detail. You can find that in a number of places, including my article on methodology in that same handbook for Greco-Roman antiquity. But when you want to find children in antiquity, we need to start to some degree when you're doing textual work with the philology. And the pace in Greek is a child. Also have a brephos, napios, infant, or young boy or girl. In Greek thought, depending on which kind of stages you're looking at, you have a hebe, and that is actually described as, in the Greek text that Philo utilizes, a stage that ends at age 14 and focuses on the ability to produce sperm, which indicates, of course, that Philo is looking particularly, like these Greek authors, at boys and not girls. Likewise, with the third stage, the hebe is capable of growing a beard, for instance. So we also need to look for the girls. And the second stage for girls, they have the same first stage as for boys with a pace, a child, is that of the Parthenos, the virgin or the unmarried girl or teenager, which begins to end with the transition of puberty and specifically the onset of menstruation. When we look at these stages, whether in Jewish texts, Greek texts, or Roman texts, you find a lot more focus on development of boys and growth and development later ages for marriage for the most part. But for girls, puberty is the transition to adulthood. And that's one of the fascinating things about looking at these terms, is that when you see them then in texts such as in the New Testament, you can ask yourself, are we looking at children or adults here? Because often modern translations do not see the children. Who's a boy? In the Mishnah, and this is Mishnah Boat 521, and I have to tell you the go-to text now for looking at not just Mishnaic texts, but for Jewish childhood in Roman times is Hagit Sivan's book, Jewish Childhood in the Roman Empire, in the Roman world, excuse me. But it gives some basic stages for boys. Study of Torah at 5 years old. At 13, he could partake in fasting or the mitzvot. At 18, he was considered ready for marriage. At 20, he began to pursue a vocation. So depending on the text you read, boys are getting married either at 20, but there's a great text from Babylonian Talmud, Kiddushin, which I think is worth reading. When someone who's 20 years of age and not married spends all his days in sin. In sin? Can you really think so? Rather say that he spends all his days in sinful thoughts. Rabbah said, in the school of Rabbi Ishmael concurs, that until the age of 20, God sits and waits for a young man to take a wife. Once he has reached that age and has not married, God exclaims, "Blast be his bones." Rabbi Hizda, the reason that I'm superior to my colleagues is that I married when I turned 16. Had I married at 14, I would have taunted even Satan. Rabbah said to Rabbi Nathan Ben Ami, while your hand is still on your son's neck between 16 and 22, marry him off. Others, however, state between 18 and 24. So these stages are not something that you can simply rely on. People are getting married, definitely boys or young adults at an older age than girls. The transitional stage that we see in the Mishnah for girls, just like in the Greek text, is also puberty. 12 years and a day. Beyond that, you could really talk about a girl reaching the age of maturity in the Mishnaic context. In Roman thought, the child, you find much the same stages in language that's come into English, for instance. The infants, the one who literally means the one who does not speak. And then you move into these stages and some of this language like adolescentes and adulti, of course, we utilize even in English today. But this could last until the age of 25. And so you see childhood being defined differently by Jews, Greeks, Romans, and later Christians as well. Because when we first start looking at these texts, that is the New Testament text and other early Christian texts, I think we're really looking at children who are belonging in categories other than Christian. That is, in the New Testament, we're looking at a very early stage of development of what would become Christianity. A few philological examples, though, and this is why I wanted to look at these stages of give us some sense of the presence of children in the New Testament. These Greek terms such as pace, paidiske, neanias, mikroi, little ones, which could be a translation. Jesus uses it often. Mikroi could refer to little ones, could be just taking over katan from Hebrew. But where do we find the children? And this is where we have our texts from our volume, Kathleen Gallagher Elkins, Feminist studies as a mother of childish approaches to the Bible. She talks about feminist criticism and offering to us visibility, agency, violence, and results, looking at the children, recognizing children's agency, that they're not simply victims, but active agents in their own life, as Kristine was talking about just a few minutes ago. But children were also vulnerable to violence. And so in Revelation 12, where we have the image of the child being snatched away from the dragon and having to be saved, we see the vulnerability. But Gallagher Elkins is also interested in how we might apply this in our own world. Gallagher Elkins sees childish studies as interdisciplinary, political, and advocacy-based. By attending to these insights from the text, she says childish interpreters can work for a world that is more livable for children. Attending to the agency and survival of children in the text also allows us to focus on the resiliency of children and how we can protect them. Sharon Bettesworth continues her excellent work in the Gospel of Mark, that is, that she has written elsewhere in our volume with narrative criticism and childish interpretation, a study of Mark 7:24-30. Narrative criticism looks at the stories, specifically in the Gospel, as narrative. And there's types of healing scenes in the Gospel of Mark. Suppliant with faith is one of those scenes. But when Bettesworth brings in childish interpretation, she notices something else, that in the Gospel of Mark, there's actually a faithful parent intercedes on behalf of a child scene. And we see this in a number of cases in the Gospel of Mark. She draws out the numerous ways in which the littleness of the child is forefronted, directing us to the child as a worthy recipient of the reign of God, even though in this scene of the Syrophoenician woman and her daughter, the child is silent and inactive. Mark's use of diminutives, she shows, it's an excellent section of her paper. Throughout this section brings to life the littleness of the child on whom Jesus acts. Anna Rebecca Zolavag, Perspectives from Disability Studies in the Pastoral Epistles, brings together issues of intersectionality and disability studies, looking at kyriarchy, which is something slightly different than patriarchy, looking at the fact that you have men who are basically running things, but not all men. Disability studies also ask us to focus on lived experience, fluid identities, symbolic meanings, and metaphors. And then she asks, what do we find about children in the pastoral epistles? Children are on display in the ideal family, and metaphorical children, such as Timothy and Titus, are found as ideal types. But she says this also invisibilizes actual children. So through the cracks, she asks, what's really going on? We can't find the enslaved children, the girls, or the slave teachers of children. Instead, we find metaphorical ideal children. But even here, one of those ideal one of the ideal children, Timothy, is called weak and young. Is he really a man? Is the fact that he's presented as weak a sign of disability? So you have the ideal children presented, but in fact, when we see through the cracks, she says, we can see the reality of children's lives. The final New Testament paper in our volume is by James Murphy, Children in Mark, a Deconstructive Approach. By utilizing deconstructive readings of children in Mark, Murphy is not satisfied simply to point to the children as harbingers of a new age, which is a role in which they're most often cast in the gospel, as he acknowledges. Instead, Murphy points to the reality that while most children do represent the reign of God in Jesus' teaching, Herodias, for instance, in Mark 6, performs for the old reign, doing a dance that represents the death dealing of this world. But he says there's another child at the end of the gospel, the enslaved girl, the Paidiski, in Mark 14, who challenges Peter that he's betraying the new reign when he denies knowing Jesus. but she also serves in the house of the high priest, a representative in the Gospel of Mark of those who are opposed to Jesus. Murphy says she neither fully symbolizes life nor death, but exists in a liminal space, challenging readers to determine which path they are on, that of the ideal child open to the reign of God or to the old world. Now, I want to spend just a few minutes looking at how we might apply some of these findings in early Christianity. I would say, for instance, that in this passage in 1 Corinthians 7, 36 to 38, we have a Parthenon, which in modern translations, if you look at verse 36, is translated as fiance. But does this really pay attention to what a Parthenos was, a young girl in antiquity? Were they really making their own marriage arrangements? The chances are probably not when you're dealing with a girl just reaching puberty, especially in antiquity where the father had this authority. I would say Parthenos probably ought to be translated as daughter or virgin daughter. And the text has to do with relationships between father and daughter. Another example, just for asking the question, for finding hidden children. In verse 14 of 1 Corinthians 7, for the unbelieving husband is made holy through his wife, and the unbelieving wife is made holy through her husband. Otherwise, your children would be unclean. But as it is, they are holy. Well, what does that mean, that they're holy? And how does this relate to entry into the ecclesia or to the early church? Were children being baptized? Was there a means of or rites of entry to bring people into the church at this time? Were people still, that is boys, being circumcised? Is there any means by which we can determine what it means for a child at this point in this context to be holy? I want to bring up and bring forward these two passages as well, Jesus inviting children, and just push a little bit beyond the boundaries of our volume that was looking particularly at the New Testament. With the development of early Christianity, we get a little bit more focus on children. Here are Jesus' teachings regarding children from Matthew 19 and 18. John Chrysostom has this text on vainglory or the right way to raise children. But in fact, when you read the text, the only children in mind are freeborn boys. The whole text, 89 out of 90 chapters, focuses on freeborn boys. But as you read the text carefully and read between the lines, look for vulnerability, look for children who are hidden, you find numerous slave children in the text. And to think that Chrysostom is just focusing on children, he is, but it has to be a certain type of child, a boy, not a girl, a free boy whose father owns slaves. Now, just have a couple more minutes. I just want to point out one place that we need to pay attention to as well. This is a photo I took of the Sardis Gymnasium a number of years ago. But beside the gymnasium is a synagogue. And we know that boys, especially, were found at gymnasia. We know that children were in the synagogue. And in fact, there's an inscription that reads, I, with my wife Regina and our children, in the fulfillment of a vow, executed from the gifts of Almighty God, all the scutloses inlay panels of the section of a wall. Now, this simply raises question about how we ought to be thinking about children in terms of blended, hybrid, and intersectional identities. How engaged were Jewish boys in the Roman gymnasium with Greek-speaking children? Sardis also is mentioned as one of the 7 churches in Revelation of John 3:1-6. Were there Christian children in the gymnasium or were they in the synagogue? We have to think of the children being present, but we also have to think about the children as being more than one thing, not simply Christian children or Jewish children in a sense, but how are they interacting with each other? I'm going to skip over a number of very nice photos that I took over the years. I'd be happy to send them to you. And even the children with trauma. We'll end with young people kissing from the Istanbul Museum and a couple of questions regarding why it's important to understand the lives of children in antiquity. I think to fully understand Judaism, to understand developing Christianity, to understand what it meant to be a Christian or Jew in the ancient world, we need to understand children. And we need to continue to ask the questions using multiple methodologies regarding where the children are and how they might help us think, not just about children themselves, but about these ancient religions and their development. So I will stop there, and I think hand it over to, I'm not sure if it's Julie or Shawn.
I'll just introduce Shawn for a moment before he begins. Of course, I want to thank Kristine and John. So Shawn Flynn is an associate professor of Hebrew Bible at St. Joseph's College, University of Alberta in Canada. His research focuses on divinity in ancient Israel and on the role of children in the ancient Near East, along other things, of course. So stage is yours, Shawn.
Thank you, Aaron, and thank you to my colleagues. I'm the Canadian scholar, so you can get the international perspective. John's Canadian as well, so it's okay. We're all good. So I'm going to share a bit about what my contribution was a little bit in the volume, and then talk just a little bit broadly about the volume in general and just the work of children, if I can. So my article is simply broadening perspectives of ancient children. It really starts with kind of the historical ancient Near Eastern Hebrew Bible comparison as my contribution. I start with a lot of simple information. You know, the volume came out of a meeting that we all had in Los Angeles that Kristine hosted. And it was just a very good open discussion. So, you know, we were all contributing very different perspectives. So I start with this common ancient Near Eastern historical comparative method, and I get into the origins of the discoveries a bit, the unlocking of cuneiform, the reactions to this new information by biblical scholarship in the early 19th century. And I do this for a very specific reason. And I also root it in Orientalism and colonialism that we now realize. But it was really about the early reactions to that type of comparative data. And I settle on, there's many ways to articulate it, but I settle on in the contribution on sameness and distinctiveness. So we know that the early reactions to these discoveries, there was a desire to keep the biblical text somehow distinct from its ancient culture and special. But then the realizing of sameness, and then this goes through ebbs and flows. I think this is a helpful discussion for us because I think this still pops up today when we get into comparative work. And I think for this, it's no longer an emerging field. It's been around for 10 years now, but some people are still just hearing about it. But for a field that's also getting into this type of work, both in New Testament, early Christianity, and Hebrew Bible, ancient Near East, this idea of sameness and distinctiveness still haunts us in the background. So we have to be aware of it. Just give a sense of my general approach. I prefer a case-by-case approach when we're talking about these comparative endeavors. Simply when we're talking about adoption, burial practice, birth, whatever, we need to fully describe that practice in my case, in the ancient Near East, as best as we can in its own cultural matrix, and then cautiously take up Hebrew Bible passages. I can talk about it a bit more, but I think the Hebrew Bible is a much different corpus than the type of literature we have available to us in the ancient Near East. So that sameness and distinctiveness can be asked all the time with each of these parallels, but it has to be asked cautiously. Now, there's multiple benefits to this type of approach. I think when we talk about sameness and distinctiveness, we get into the kind of my interests about the Hebrew Bible and why. It's the question of why, not how the parallel ended up in the Hebrew Bible, but why they're using it, why they're taking it up. Why is the Hebrew Bible carrying forward this or that common view of children? Or, so that's one possibility. And what does it do when it echoes that? What's it trying to say? What's its rhetorical weight in that moment in the text when the Hebrew Bible is referencing a child? What's it doing there? And I'll get into my reflections later about the broad contribution this field is making and what we can no longer ignore. Or sometimes the Hebrew Bible will be making a change to this common cultural echo, but we can't realize that until we know what the common cultural view was around the time generally, as we're able to reconstruct it. Sometimes I think we have an even more satisfying view when we talk about the sameness and distinctiveness in these comparative parallels, is sometimes there's an aspect like a famous line from Jeremiah 1:4-5, "For I formed you in the womb." It's often held up by early biblical commentators as this distinctly unique Israelite Hebrew Bible perspective. But when we get into what was said about children in the ancient world, we realize this is actually a commonly held kind of view of this value of the child, or as Kristine calls it, a child in potential, a child who has a contribution to the household. So I think we can start to correct and adapt our assumptions about some biblical texts in the past, and at the same time discover new avenues for research. And it gets to my interest about going beyond the descriptive into the interpretive, why the Hebrew Bible authors do this. So in this very simple contribution, and for me, myself, this work has matured over time, but I have a section on sameness and a section on distinctiveness. I'll skip distinctiveness because it's a lot harder to tease out and you have to be really careful with your examples, but I'll offer one on sameness. I offer one text in the volume. It's from the Yale Oriental series, 1186. And it's a very well-known text. It's in Foster, and a lot of early Childist interpreters were using this text and citing it in a lot of their work. So I thought it was a really good one to start with. It's this descriptive text of, in the fluids of intercourse, bone was formed. You have, there was no son, Asluhi, Enki son, that's the head god. Loosen the bonds and the door bolt for the moment of birth to come forward. In other texts, Asluki also functions as midwife. So there's all this beautiful imagery of this birth and how the gods and goddesses are functioning in the moment of birth in the domestic cult and in the domestic sphere. So, I mean, something like this is a really interesting text. I'm not claiming that the Hebrew Bible authors knew this text. That's not the type of work I'm into. I'm saying when we describe the large contours of the ancient Near East, that cultural matrix, the writers of the Hebrew Bible understood this context as well and are utilizing similar patterns or thoughts and ideas. So when we look at a text like this in relation, we discover a lot of interesting things. There's a role between the child and divine agents. And this is where Kristine's comments and my colleagues come in when we start flipping the conversation, not with adult-centric work, but child-centric work. We start asking different questions about how the child is involved in that moment. So the child is involved with divine agents. There's a lot of connection between mythological literature, like the literature we would understand from the famous creation stories, and those domestic prayer moments. So these domestic prayers that echo this mythological tradition around child's lives. We realize the major deities are involved, Asluhi and Beladili, who are major deities in like the Atrahasis creation epic and things of this. And they're involved in an average human birth. This isn't the birth of a special king in a story. This is a birth that you would suspect that the average cultic household could leverage or bring up in their prayer for a successful birth, for example. Now, if we look at a text like Psalm 139, I'll just give one example. This is a really interesting text. Verse 13 to 15 has this beautiful language about, you formed my inward parts, you knitted me in my mother's womb. So there's all this language about Yahweh's involvement in the early stages of a child before birth. Now, that seems quite unique in the Hebrew Bible, but when we extend that context in a simple text like this YOS text I was just describing to you, a lot more becomes apparent than we first thought might have been going on in Psalm 139. So the psalm before this, verses 13 to 15, describe the darkness, and they describe the writer's kind of sense of being lost in their relationship with Yahweh. But then it's interesting how that darkness echoes the darkness of texts like birth texts that you'd see in the ancient Near East. There's this reference to the lower parts of the earth, which is kind of odd in the Hebrew Bible, but that sounds very similar to the echoing of creation traditions like Belat-Ili's use of the clay. And one thing I find very fascinating is a text like Psalm 139 is the writer is echoing back to Yahweh's relation to them at the pre-birth stage to kind of come into a better relationship with their own God. So it's recalling Yahweh's role in childbirth at a moment of distress in their adulthood. So it's not just about the adult. Their life as a child and their connection to Yahweh, possibly through their household, is becoming important to them. So this is where the voice, agency, value, and vulnerability, as Kristine said, kind of comes in. It's also interesting that Psalm 13 to 15 is the turning point in this lament psalm, where this description of Yahweh's involvement in the womb starts becoming the turning point for this adult in prayer, where they've recalled their own childhood, as it were. So it's a stressful time. And I think what the comparison starts to do, even with sameness, it doesn't do something as simple as, look, the Hebrew Bible isn't really special. That's not what's trying to be said. But I think it starts opening up the complex of when a Hebrew Bible author references a child or a child's life, they have a whole complex of traditions behind them that's echoing and impinging on that text. We don't know exactly which text they had in front of them, if they even had any text in front of them. It's part of a larger cultural matrix. Were they trained in some Western-based scribal school similar to the Western areas of the Mesopotamian Empire? I mean, those are really complicated questions. But what we can say is that there's these similarities and there's these basically this flowering of a tradition that I think has gone unrecognized when we talk about children in the ancient world. Like I said, I'll skip distinctiveness, but I'll share with you another kind of data set, or at least one letter. There's this beautiful letter. It's a Neo-Syrian, it's actually a dedication text. And it starts out in a female voice. And the female is describing how, why are you adrift within me? She is describing a failed pregnancy in which the child is still within her. And then she calls out to Belit Ili. So she has this moment of kind of calling out to the deity of childbirth and midwifery. And then she starts describing her own death. So whatever complications are happening from this, it's a very difficult moment. And she's starting to die in the text. But then what we know is, because it's a dedication text, the Neo-Syrian husband had this commissioned in his deceased wife's voice to remember both his child and his wife. It's that type of data or literature set, like children are valuable, children are vulnerable, but the lives of ancient children are there. And I think John described this quite well. And I think one of the things we're trying to all get at is when you start asking the question of how these children existed and what they did, it starts flipping around a lot of our interpretive work for Hebrew Bible and New Testament studies. I'll share one quick paragraph in kind of my summary of how I understand this work. The biblical text, in its own unique collection of religious material, is linked to specific urban centers and produced by a small group of elites. Naturally, biblical authors interact with their cultural matrix, but they also forge their own path. At times, a comparative method will reinforce and echo ideas about children as seen in other cultures. At other times, it will uncover some new expression of the child's value by using the common cultural expression as a starting point. However, one can only understand that moment by clearly understanding the regular perception of children in the ancient Near East, insofar as that is possible to reconstruct. In addition to the Hebrew Bible, Mesopotamian contracts, letters, mythology, adoptions, prayers, and burial practices work in concert to provide a broad perspective about what the ancients thought about children. The Hebrew Bible is not composed in a cultural vacuum, but lives and breathes its contexts. When the Hebrew Bible talks about children, it is drawing upon their known value and rhetorical weight. Children have value beyond economics. Children have domestic cultic value. The Hebrew Bible uses, reacts, and sometimes moves beyond these common perspectives for a different agenda. So I think that's a lot of what's going on. Maybe in the discussion period, I can share what I feel what we've been taught about this, but I'll offer one thought about this field as I've come to experience it, is that children can no longer be ignored in biblical studies. That's one huge takeaway. So from now on, any commentary, biblical commentary being written that has a child in it, there is now 10 years of good, solid data, publications, research that is a whole new field that the biblical children aren't only important, but there is something rhetorically often being done when a child is mentioned in a biblical text. And now the data is present for that conversation to occur. So I would say, not only can you not skip over children because they're important, I would even go as far to say that I think biblical authors are often doing something or saying something or trying to make a point by the way they leverage and use children in a biblical text. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Shawn. We now move on to our next respondent, Julie Faith Parker, who is an associate professor of biblical studies at the General Theological Seminary of the Episcopal Church in New York City. She is the author of many books, several of them on children in the biblical world. So thank you, Julie.
Thank you so much. And thank you especially to the Albright Institute for this invitation. In 2017, I was in Jerusalem with my husband, and we stopped in the Albright Institute totally unannounced. To paraphrase a verse from the Second Testament, I was a stranger and you welcomed me. And so it's really wonderful to have the chance to be here today with you. I also feel that this is a great opportunity for the field because you are inviting new voices into this conversation. Many of us who contributed to this book that Kristine and John edited also contributed to a book that Shawn edited, also contributed to a book that Sharon Betzworth and I edited, all within the past 2 years. And so the field is really growing, but a lot of us are talking all the time to each other. And you give us the chance now to talk with others. And for that, we're so grateful. And I have therefore geared my remarks towards people who might not be as familiar with this field of childish biblical interpretation. And so I'm going to talk just briefly about the field. I'll talk about my article illustrating what the book does and how that ties into the wider goals of this book. And then finally circle back to what Shawn mentioned with a little more detail, why it is so important not to ignore the Bible's children. First, childish biblical interpretation is a phrase that you've heard during our talk today, but you might not be familiar with it because some people haven't even heard this term. This definition of childish biblical interpretation is that which focuses on the agency and action of children and youth in the biblical text, instead of seeing them as primarily passive, victimized, or marginalized, is one that was published in the Oxford Handbook of Biblical Narrative in 2016. This definition has been helpful and workable, but I want you to know it has been nuanced since 2016. Now we're asking questions like, what does agency mean for a child? Is it different for a child than for an adult? For example, if you have a baby in your life, you know that babies have the power to totally upend your life, and yet that's not the same as adult agency in terms of speech or action. It's a very different kind of power. And so that's something that we're looking at now as we look at this agency. And indeed, what does agency mean? We're also looking at the construction of child characters. How have the Bible authors presented children? Whose interests are being served in these portrayals? And that's why the work of Kristine and Shawn and others who do work with comparative texts and also archaeology is so very valuable. And John's pictures as well added so much to our understanding of the biblical world to see what we can get from many sources, which is the great gift of this book. We look at children from so many different lenses. My particular article, The Force of Adonai Awakens, Social Scientific Methodologies and Children Who Rise from the Dead, asks one particular question. Within the Hebrew Bible, there are 2 stories of people who were dead and come back to life. And both of those children who are brought back from death, both those people brought back from death are children. They're both children. Why? I ask, why are there only children who are brought from death to life within the Hebrew Bible? And how can social scientific approaches help us to answer this question? So the social scientific approaches, as you see here, draw on anthropology, archaeology, economics, political science, psychology, and sociology. However, it's really anthropology and sociology that have served the biblical field best. We live, you and I live, in cultures that are very far from the biblical world. But there are a lot of people around the world who live in houses that they make themselves, they wear clothes that they sew themselves, they eat food that they brew themselves. They're tribal cultures, they live with beliefs and religious traditions from their own ancestors, not that started out from entirely foreign times and places. So how can these cultures help us to learn about the biblical world, to which they are much closer than our own culture? And so I apply sociology and anthropology to the 2 stories of revived children. And I've got some cute little drawings here that will help you remember these stories. So you may recall in 1 Kings 17 through 24, there's the story of the prophet Elijah and the son of the widow of Zarephath. In this text, this woman has fed Elijah during a drought, and he in turn saved her and her household by making her jug of oil and her jug of meal magical so they would not run out. Then her son dies, so she appeals to him for help. And Elijah comes and he lies down on the child and he brings him back to life. Similarly, there's a story of Elisha in 2 Kings 4, in which a Shunammite woman has hosted Elisha, and he has repaid her kindness with the birth of a child. And this son, when he is small, goes out to the fields with his father. He complains of head pain and he dies. She goes hard after finding Elisha, and she does, and she brings him to where the boy is, and he lies down on the child 3 times until the child comes back to life. So why is it a child in the only 2 accounts of the entire Hebrew Bible where we read of a person being dead and coming back to life? So to research this, I looked at the role of shamans in various cultures, because I suggest that both Elijah and Elisha here are acting as shamans. A shaman is someone who can take spiritual energy and acts essentially as a funnel for taking that energy and channeling it and making it go exactly where they direct it. And so Elijah and Elisha are able to do this. In both of these stories, the prophets have to expend energy. Elijah calls on God and Elisha gets up and he walks around and then he tries again. And in both instances, the children are revived. And these stories show that children matter, not only to their mothers, but also to the prophets who are willing to expend all this energy on this task, and to the deity. But still, why children? Why not a story about an adult coming back to life? And here I looked at shamans, the sociological phenomenon of shamans and what they do. And what I discovered by looking at the work of Shirakolkov in Siberia with the Tungu people is that shamans have an ability to work better with children than with adults. Basically, the thought behind this is that the soul is more recently from the spiritual realm. The soul of a child is more recently deposited, if you will, into that body, and it takes time to stabilize. And so the soul can get more easily separated from the body. And so the son of the widow of Zarephath, his nephesh, we're told in the text, or his life force leaves him, and Elijah appeals to the deity to bring it back. In the story of the Shunammite son, the mother urgently seeks Elisha. Nevertheless, she persisted. She goes after him. She pushes aside Gehazi. She is going to get this prophet because she knows that timing is crucial. The chances of the shaman's success are greater with a child than with an adult. That is what my social scientific study taught me. And so the story of a child being revived by these prophets might have had increased credibility as to the wonder-working powers of these prophets. It would just seem more plausible that a child could be raised from the dead. Also, I interviewed 2 modern healers. There are many shamans around us today. We might think of this as some sort of biblical oddity, but it is not. And in my interviews with these 2 modern shamans, I discovered the emotional toll that it takes to work with children for these shamans, because they're so vested in the children, so the children have so much of their lives ahead of them. And also that children have this recent connection to the spiritual world, and they have easier access to the spiritual world, which is something that shamans appreciate. And so these social scientific approaches help us to understand a world where these miracles can occur, not to be written off with our post-enlightenment blinders, but to really recognize the power that is taking place in the text, that takes place in the world today. And here this power is used to give young people a renewed chance of life. So why study the Bible's children? There are many ways to look at the children in the Bible. And as Shawn mentioned, it is so important to notice these children. And when you do, there is a lot of there are a lot of resources that are available. And many of them are here, right here in this method on children and this book on children, this volume on children and methods. So why study the Bible's children? First of all, children and youth comprised about 1/3 to 1/2 of ancient populations. People did not live to be that old. And so demographically, a large percentage of the population comprised of children. If you write about children, you write about the biblical world and you leave out children, as many of these books behind me do, you are ignoring a large section of the culture that you seek to understand. And second of all, studying the Bible offers a new angle for exploring sociological issues, for all sorts of issues, and this volume does that so well. One of the articles looks at disability and children. Another one by Jason Riley looks at war and children. Katerina Koslova is doing a volume now on adoption and children. How we look at these issues really changes with children as the focus. Also, studying the children adds depth to our understanding of famous biblical characters. For example, Moses. A lot of us overlook that he needs to be bicultural to have the role that he does in Israel's story. And that comes from when he's a child. This needs to be taken into account in our understanding of these texts. Child characters also appear throughout the Bible. It's really amazing, not just Genesis, not just Mark. Take a look at the book of Job and notice how many times they talk about the children of the wicked as well as Job's own children. If you look for them, they are there because children were integral to the ancient world as they are to our world today. But even more so then because it was an age-integrated society. We live in an age-segregated society, but not so then. Also, studying the children points to a shared experience that the reader has with the character. Everyone has a point of privilege. We all know the vulnerability of being a child, and so we can look at these texts with a measure of authority just based on our own experience. What other aspect of our lived experience do we have in common besides we were all children? This is a point of privilege that we share not only with each other, but also for entering the text. Children have an important theological role in both testaments. In the Hebrew Bible, they are how the covenant is passed on. And in the New Testament, Jesus picks up a child repeatedly and tells his hearers that people need to be like this child. And finally, studying the Bible, the Bible's children affirms the role that living children have in communities of faith. I say that I teach at a seminary, but also beyond that, the roles that living children have in our communities and the connections that can be made with children in the world today. We are constantly asking ourselves in this field, so what? Why does this work matter? And one of the reasons it matters is to make connections between issues that children face in the Bible, like debt slavery and human trafficking, and how this is going on around us, and how these stories can be a resource and also empower living children. And so, in conclusion, if you miss the Bible's children, you are missing a lot of the Bible. This is a broad field. It is ever growing. We're well over 10 years old now. So as you know, adolescence is a very exciting time in one's development. And we invite you to join us. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Julie. So we've now heard from all of our panelists. So Kristine or John, would you like to take a few minutes to respond to any of the comments or the ideas that we've heard here?
Yeah, in many ways, these comments, I think, really sort of solidify what we're trying to do in the book. And I know, I just want to stress again what I think both Shawn and Julie were saying, that you can't ignore children in biblical, in the study of the Bible. It's not some interesting sideline that might be of interest to a few folks. children in some ways were marginalized in antiquity, but that's not all they were. And I think Julie gave the data just in her last slide, perhaps, or second last, about a third of people in antiquity were children. Mark Golden gives that data in his Children in Childhood in Classical Athens. He calculates about 33% of people in Athens, in classical Athens, were under the age of 15. Kathleen, in her chapter in our volume, cites that data. So the issue is not simply, they're there, so it'd be interesting to acknowledge them and wave at them as we pass them by, but how do we really make them integral to what we're doing? And I don't know if I'll let Kristine respond as well, because Sharon also had a question that I see in the chat now that's sort of related to that, but I'd like Kristine to respond as well.
Thanks, Shawn, and thanks, Julie and Shawn, for your comments both. I think John summed up nicely what we all of us here today hope is the main point, that children cannot be ignored when you're going through and reading texts anymore. And I think Shawn's point picked up nicely when he was discussing how some things we think that something's very distinct, or it must be only in the Hebrew Bible. And then you go and you look and you do comparative work and you find, well, oh, maybe this idea isn't so unique to the biblical text. And it helps us understand this is the ancient societies better, which also helps us then understand the biblical text better. And for those of us who are scholars of the ancient world, doing social histories and understanding the past can help us better understand some of the things that we're going through in the present. And I say this in the back of my mind, thinking about all of the ancient scholars who just cheered because they're scholars of ancient pandemics. And they're like, finally, my work is relevant today, right? So there's always connections that can be made between the past and the present. And we're hoping that our work that is being done with children in the past will also have implications for children as the present as well. As Julie was saying, work is now being done on children as sex slaves, children as child trafficking, children migrants. I know Anna Rebecca Solovag is working in that area as well. So there's many different possibilities and avenues that are just waiting for scholars to pick up on. Thank you.
I'll read now the question that John mentioned, a question from Sharon Betzworth. The question is, John's comment about the intersectional identities of children is helpful. You mentioned Jewish children in Roman gymnasiums. What other intersections of children's identity are often overlooked by biblical interpreters?
Should I take that first of all, maybe? So I think I tried to hint at a couple of things, Sharon. Thanks for that question. I'm starting to think through this a lot more. And initially I thought of it simply in, well, there are children who are present, but then you start to really realize that children in antiquity too weren't just one thing, right? There were enslaved children. And again, I think that's relevant for discussions of trafficking today and how children are used sexually and in other ways by traffickers. That was baked into the ancient world. Children in the Greco-Roman world were often abandoned and raised by slave traders or prostituted as they grew up, for instance. And one of the things I think intersectionality teaches us to do is to ask for where there are other children. And so I was trying to pay attention in the Chrysostom text, for instance, and couldn't go into any detail here, in the way in which you have the reality of children that he's ignoring. So only certain people are seen as valued in that text on vainglory or the right way to raise children. More broadly, I also think, this would be the last thing I say about this right now, I think, is that it does help us more broadly, I think about big questions like the parting of the ways. When does Christianity become something different than Judaism? When is it no longer simply a part of the Jewish tradition? And I think thinking about children, were boys being circumcised? When did that stop? Because then you start to think about the way in which communities might divide. Are they Jewish? Is there a new Christian thing going on? So I think thinking about these questions can also help us in the broader sense of thinking about these religious traditions, not just with respect to children, but as a whole.
Okay, are there any other comments or answers to this question, or any other final comments, I would say?
I'd just like to add, I think one important aspect of intersectional identity is that of economics. You know, we talk about children in general, but there are children in the Hebrew Bible who are kings. Josiah at 8 years old, what is that like for him as a king so young? And that's the one area where there really hasn't been much work done in Hebrew Bible studies, of which I'm aware. But that's a huge question, because we all know our economics play a very big role in determining the shape of our lives.
I would say another area and thing to keep in mind is that when most of us are studying these texts, we're looking at texts that were written by people who could write, people who were affluent, people who had a very specific worldview they were trying to put forth. And so trying to dig under, especially the biblical texts, and figure out, like, who were the normal people? Not normal, but who were the people that weren't privileged? Who are the everyday people, and what was life like for them? It is also an interesting question as well, as we think about power dynamics and the children that we are told about versus the children that we're not necessarily told about. And so I think coming from an intersectional approach and thinking about power dynamics and thinking about enslavement or not and servitude and what exactly that meant could also have a huge impact, especially as we then think about the way that the Bible has been interpreted, you know, through the 18th and 19th and early 20th centuries, thinking about just enslavement in general and child laborers. I'm constantly telling my 12-year-old who's begging to work, I'm like, you know, there's laws for that now. Like, step back. He just wants to make money. But things like this, I think, are very helpful when, to think about from an intersectional approach. Shawn, I don't know if you have anything you want to weigh in.
Yeah, I mean, just picking up a bit on what Kristine and a bit what John said, it's not just about children and the method of interpreting children. It's how do we understand when everyone does like scholarship in these areas, when are we, like, you can't ignore them, right? So it's essential part of if they're mentioned, they're there, you have to deal with them. But one interesting possibility is scribal culture. So a lot's been said about scribal culture. It's very complicated, but and it's a very limited group of children, but these are children learning, right? And we have Western-based scribal schools, and we have the curriculum from Western-based scribal schools. So what is it about these children that are learning to be Judite scribes, maybe, if that's what's going on? And how does their, not just their scribal training, but their lives as children impact what's going on with the entire formation of the Hebrew Bible? So even like a question like just as broad as that, that's this whole other area of scholarship, the aspect of what is the role of children in this whole complex. Even that, I haven't explored it, and there's a little bit in my book and a little bit in some other books picking at this question, but that's an entire area that there's a whole nother realm of scholarship that could ask, well, what's the function of children in these relationships and the building of whatever was going on with Judite scribal culture, for example.
I'd just like to add that when we look at the scribes, Christy, I think it's such an important point that there is a built-in elitism here just to be able to read, write, have the materials. And that is why I think the minor characters are so important to look at, because those children, like in the stories of Elijah and Elisha that I just mentioned, they have to behave in ways that are consonant with the culture, or else your attention as a reader or a hearer will be diverted from the prophet The wonder-working prophet is to be your focus. So those children have to behave in ways that are not going to call out your attention. And so that gives us some insight as to the lives of children. And we see in those stories, for example, that children do matter and that their mothers do advocate for them. Even though that's something that we would expect in our culture, Mark Golden points this out. Something that is consistent with your own culture is still noteworthy. It's not natural, right? It's all still a construct. And so we have to notice that as well. And we see the value of children in those stories, just everyday children, because this is what would have happened in the culture.
Okay, thank you. I think maybe we'll take a final question. We have a question from Hagit Sivan, who you've mentioned during your talk today. Do you see it? It's quite long. I'll try to shorten it. She of course thanks you for your splendid and meaningful contributions to the field. And she says she's wrestled with the definition and distinctions between children who remain largely anonymous and childhood, which has been defined as the institutionally and discursively constructed conditions in which particular children grow up. How do we penetrate the anonymous of children? We know names from primarily only two types of recording: work contracts and death inscriptions. What do these two areas suggest about the constructs of childhood? How we can, in addition, link with fundamental studies such as Viviana Zilazer's Pricing the Priceless Child, which asks pertinent questions. Could these be applied to children in the vast and varied domains of antiquity? So, who wants to respond?
I can try for a start, like the first part of the question, which I haven't read, Pricing the Priceless Child. So for me, this gets into the distinctions about what the Hebrew Bible is versus what ancient Near Eastern data sets are around children, right? So I do think that the ancient Near Eastern data sets, I'm primarily looking up Mesopotamia, is much more reflective of real lives than what we have in the Hebrew Bible. So I'm very comfortable with the idea that biblical authors are utilizing the rhetorical weight of children to make many points about whatever text or issue is in front of them. Often, I think it's for the social promotion of Yahwism in some way. That's what I think is going on there. So maybe, how do the children that are mentioned, right? That's the important children that become biblical characters or something like this, like the boys and the bears text, it's just Elijah is there, but these, what is 43 children, I forget the number, but, they're really anonymous. But the violence done to them, and I say curse protections are in the background here, and the efficacy or the ability of the prophet to be legitimate in their cultural context is probably some things going on in that text. So even though a child is anonymous and not mentioned, there's still that whole complex of assumptions about what's going on in the culture, about what's important about that child to make the point that a biblical author is trying to make. But I would agree with you that a lot of the actually names of children are limited to a certain amount of texts. But just because the naming is not done in a lot of other, take something as simple as the Code of Hammurabi, where an adopted child, I think it's in 185, if the father doesn't teach them the trade, they can actually go back to their home family. We've talked about agency. So we can still have a whole discussion about what children's lives and meanings are, and at different social levels. No doubt that's in one of the Uwilum texts. So they don't have to be named in order to, like childhood burials, that's just, there's this compelling dimension of taking care of the buried child and what it means for the domestic cult, or all of that. The text I mentioned, the Neo-Assyrian text of this mourning for the husband of the deceased wife, and the deceased wife mourning for her deceased child. So, mortality rates and stuff. So yeah, they're not named, but at the same time, there's a lot going on without them having to be named that can still be offered up. So just some reflections there.
So Hagit, thank you so much. And I just want to say to you too, thank you for your work, which I've learned so much from and still learning from. Let me suggest something that maybe there are some names of children that we know well. Are any of Jesus' apostles children? how many of them are married? I know not people don't like to necessarily go there, and I don't want to just think about stages of life. But when you think about, as being like strict, hierarchically guided things, at this age, you must get married. But given that so many of them are not married, and we see the Mishnah looking at marriage at an early age, 14 is, and now admittedly, some of this is from the Babylonian Talmud centuries later, but early marriage was more common for Jewish young men than you find in the Roman context, for instance. How about Paul, who is called a Neanias, in Acts 7:58, which is a young man? Is that a teenager? Eutychus in Acts of the Apostles chapter 20 is also called a Neanias, but after he falls out of the window and they go pick him up, he's called a pace, a child. So are we missing children amongst some of the most well-known? Here I'm talking specifically about the New Testament context, or at least young men on the transition point from childhood to adulthood. I'm thinking of Jesus' apostles more as teenagers than I am as 30 and 40-year-olds, which is what you're always going to get in any sort of movie. Maybe they're kids. Who else has the time to leave their families and go follow a teacher?
Thanks, Shawn. That's a very thought-provoking question, for sure. I think it also depends, circling back to this question, what time period we're looking at and what geographical locations we're looking at. For example, in the earlier periods which I studied, children aren't named in death inscriptions at all. Would that they were, I'd have a lot more to study and I'd be really excited. So Matt, if you dig any up, please let me know. There's also, like you say, work contracts or slave contracts for buying and selling children. There's adoption contracts. So more towards the social institutions of which these children are a part is generally where we start to see them named. So I think it's a very interesting question. What we can know about named children versus unnamed children and what that tells us about how society understands and values a child. So that's, I think, a very a good question, and I think one that the field will maybe take up as things move forward.
Okay.
It's just, I appreciate the question so much. I think there's an important distinction between the concept of children and childhood with cultures, which all cultures have, and the conception. The conception is when you articulate it and you're very clear on it. And when we see in the Hebrew Bible, there are different concepts of childhood because there are about 6 or 7 different words. They're not well attested, but they're there in terms of childhood in its various stages. So we do see that this awareness is there, even though, as Shawn mentioned, it's not the goal of the writers at all. And so it's not articulated.
I can also add just a bit of John's comments. Like, everyone has not everyone, but there are people that have an ongoing status as child, right? So I think there's Newsy and Emar contracts that are about disinheriting the child from the cult, the whole household cult, and disinheriting from the dead. But implied in that is they have to take care of the dead and take care of the cult. So in entering the domestic cult, they take on the domestic cult and the care of the parents or whoever's dying and to bury them well. So you have this ongoing status as child throughout your life in your responsibility to your family household when you take that over, depending how we define status. And I think in a lot of biblical texts, this is in the background, the sacrifice of Isaac as a classic, like the loss of Isaac would be bad because it's also the loss of the cult, the domestic cult. So there's a lot more that can be done with it just beyond the named versus unnamed child. The value of children might not be on the connection of whether they're named or not.
Okay, at this point, we want to thank everyone, thank the panelists, and if anyone in the audience, of course, have more questions, I'm sure that the panelists would be happy to answer your questions, and you can contact them personally. So again, thank you for everyone for joining us tonight. and supporting us on this fine evening here in Israel and morning or day in North America. So thank you all.
Thanks so much for having us.
Thank you so much. It's really been an honor to be here. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you all.
Thanks again, Aaron and Matthew. Well, bye, everyone.
Okay.
See you later.
Bye. Thank you,
Bye-bye.
everyone. Bye.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.